I work at Kootenai Health, and Kootenai Kids is very essential to our daily routine and our daily lives.
Are you gonna paint?
If they didn't have daycare here, it would be a big challenge.
We recognized the need about 30 years ago for daycare for our employees. And we've come to realize it's been such an unbelievable resource for the ability to recruit and retain people.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Erpelding. I'm the Vice President of Government and Community Relations at the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And today we have a broad conversation about the impacts of access to childcare and its impact on our economy in Idaho, based on some substantial research that was done by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Before we get going, though, I'd like to thank the folks who have been the leaders on this in Idaho and have sponsored this event today. The Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry and the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children have been working very hard on efforts to move forward, along with many other organizations. But these two organizations really have been pushing over the last year to move forward access to early child care education programs and access to child care in general. Today, we have an incredible guest with us, and she is with the U.S. Chamber Foundation, and I'd like to welcome Julia Barfield. Julia is the Senior Manager of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation Center for Education and Workforce. She leads the Chamber Foundation's early childhood education portfolio, which includes educating and engaging the business community to invest in young children and their families. Prior to joining the Chamber Foundation, she was the Federal Government Relations Manager for the Save the Children Action Network and was responsible for their early childhood education portfolio. She's worked in several social services programs, including Head Start, Early Head Start, and at a youth crisis shelter where she advocated for teens in the child welfare system. She has a BA from Westmont College in anthropology and Hispanic Studies, and a dual master's in social work and public health from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Welcome, Julia. It's really exciting to have you on today. How are you doing?
Thanks so much, Matt. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm just wondering, how is the U.S. Chamber managing the COVID pandemic, and how has your life changed as a result of this terrible infectious disease?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I think we saw each other last in February in DC, and it feels like a totally different world than when we saw each other in person. We had hosted an event launching this report that we're going to talk about in a little bit here, and several other reports from different states, but the Chamber has gone fully remote. We went remote in mid-March. I think I'm totally biased, but I think they've done a great job managing our events. I told Matt earlier when we were talking, we used to host 3,000 events a year. So those were all in person. So we've pivoted to a lot of virtual events, but I'm incredibly grateful to still have a job. So yeah.
As am I. The question that I have before we get started about the report is, what was the impetus for the U.S. Chamber Foundation to really start to dig into the economic impacts of childcare and early childhood education? How did that come to fruition as a policy issue within the Chamber?
Yeah, so I sit in the Center for Education and Workforce. It's a little complicated. A couple different teams within the foundation, and our team looks at education and workforce challenges across the lifespan. And our most robust portfolio has always been workforce. But what was interesting is 4 or 5 years ago, we could not have a workforce conversation without having a childcare conversation. And we found that as we were talking to student parents, as we were talking to young employees, we kept talking about reskilling or upskilling, and childcare was continuing to become a top issue and a barrier for them to pursue their career goals. So we started this portfolio with a report called Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow, which I'm going to dive into some of the stats from that report today. But it really was our kind of stake in the ground to say this is an economic issue, and we can't be having this conversation in a vacuum thinking, this is just a family issue, because it really is impacting all of us.
It is. And I think COVID has kind of really laid that bare for everyone to see. I mean, in April, May, and June, both my wife and I were trying to work with a 3-year-old crawling all over us, and it is incredibly difficult, and its impact on our economy is dramatic in normal times, let alone in a time like this. Well, let's start with your presentation, and then folks, if you have questions, put them in the comments box and we'll answer them on the backside.
Great, thank you so much. So as Matt said, I'm Julia, and I am from the U.S. Chamber of Foundation. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are the nonprofit branch of the U.S. Chamber, and so we support businesses and the employer community with education and workforce challenges. So I lead our early education portfolio, but we really look across the lifespan of an individual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we have done to date. I'm going to share some specific data that we found in Idaho, and then also include some new data that we found since COVID has become the reality. Next slide, please. So just for your knowledge, we are all coming to this conversation from different perspectives. I know, depending on who you represent or, your belief system, you are coming to this conversation with a different lens. And so I include this slide just to give you some background that the Chamber Foundation is looking at this issue as an economic issue. We really, my whole goal is to ensure that we have strong businesses and a strong economy. And so from the research that we know in science of young children, which I'll dive into, and what we know about the role that childcare plays in working parents' lives, we really see that access to high quality, affordable childcare huge factor to ensuring that we have a strong workforce who then work for strong businesses. And as a result, we have a strong economy. So again, everyone's coming to this conversation from a different perspective, but I like to include this just to give some background. Next slide, please. So the biggest finding, and I think the reason why we are so passionate and dedicated to early childhood education is because it is this time in a young child's life where we really have the best opportunity to ensure a strong foundation upon which all future learning is built. But at the same time, every dollar that we're investing in a young child is paid for, in the benefits to their family too. So we really see this as a 2-generation workforce issue, and really, one of the most efficient uses of both public and private funding. And just, before I dive in, all of this data has to do with families, obviously, and this is no commentary on family structure or values or, your perspective on this. This is really talking about folks who don't have the choice to stay home. We've had, during the pandemic, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people leave the workforce. And so when we're talking about access to childcare, I just want to remind everyone that this is a commentary, and all this data is about people who are not choosing to stay home to raise children. They are, either being forced to leave the workforce when they financially can't afford it, or they're changing jobs or making career decisions based on childcare needs, not necessarily on what's best for the economic stability of their family. So next slide, please. So this data is pre-pandemic, but I want to talk a little bit about the changing demographics of our workforce. Prior to the pandemic, we saw that about 40% of businesses could not take on jobs or could not take on more work because they had jobs. I think for any one of you who are employers, this may be true, but we definitely saw this in every community in every state that we worked in prior to the pandemic. This meant that, again, pre-pandemic, we were going to have 6 million unfilled jobs. We recognize that advancements in technology will increase this number, but we projected by 2020 we'd have 6 million unfilled jobs. I think our unemployment rates look very differently than these projections, but I say this because we have an issue that is only being exacerbated by the pandemic. We were having concerns about access to childcare prior to the pandemic, and that was really impacting families, businesses, and our economy. So, over the past 10 to 20 years, the workforce looks very different than it did, when many other folks were, trying to find access to childcare. And so, actually, can you advance the next slide, please? So for your knowledge, roughly 12 million children are in out-of-home paid care. And what we saw from our reports, which I'll dive into in a little bit, is that even dual income, higher income households were trying to cobble together care with multiple care arrangements. So, this is 12 million children in out-of-home care, but that family could have multiple caregivers. So, in Idaho, for example, in our report, we found that 78% of families, working parents, relied on some external family to pitch in. So maybe they're going to a childcare program, either a home-based or center-based program 4 days a week, but then grandma or an aunt or an uncle stays with that child 1 day a week. Or, because someone's shift is 12 hours, they've got paid home care for 6 hours, but then another family member comes in and does the other 6 hours. So really what we have seen is that childcare equations, that's what we're referring to as how parents are figuring out how to meet their care needs, really depend on a significant amount of out-of-home care. We also have found that 2/3 of women with children under the age of 5 are in the workforce. Again, this is not a women's issue. We really see this as an economic issue, but I bring this up because this is impacting predominantly, and as we're seeing about who's being impacted by the pandemic, women are definitely shouldering the burden of the pandemic and caregiver needs more so than their male partners or husbands. Next slide, please. So 8 out of 10 births today are to millennials. So again, if you think about, if you're an employer and you look at your workforce and you divide it between either millennials or women, those are the individuals who are being most impacted by this. That's probably a pretty significant amount of your workforce. And that's just a direct impact, right? That's not even indirect kind of ripple effects of childcare breakdowns and how that affects a team function or recruitment or retention or turnover rates. So that's just a direct impact. Similarly, we found that 1/4 of college students are raising children and 50% of those are raising children under 5. So again, as we're talking about, student debt, we're having a national conversation about the implications of student debt. We really see that childcare is impacting children or parents' access to higher education, and yet we're not necessarily having a higher education and childcare conversation, right? They're two separate conversations, but yet they're interconnected. Next slide, please. So again, 13 million Americans roughly are in their prime working years, and they're the ones who are shouldering the burden of both full-time caregiving and full-time work. And this results in an economic impact to businesses, both directly and indirectly, to about the tune of $3 billion a year. There have been some studies that have shown as high as 57 billion, and that's with a B, so billion. But anywhere from 3 to 57 billion is a significant impact on our economies and our businesses. Next slide, please. So pivoting briefly, that was all the impact on our current workforce. And as I mentioned earlier, what we know about brain science now tells us that the first 5 years of life are really our best opportunity to lay a foundation. So this is from our report. I recognize that the graph ends by 2012, but the investments we're making in our K-12 system and the subsequent math and reading abilities of our graduating seniors are roughly the same, give or take. So this is a graph that shows our investments in K-12 education as a country. So these are federal investments. And the NAEP scores, which are assessment of math and reading abilities of graduating seniors, how they're changing. This is not a knock on the K-12 system. What this is showing us is that we're making huge investments without necessarily the return that we're hoping to see. And at the same time, that means that something's wrong, right? And what's happening is children are entering our K-12 system, entering kindergarten unprepared or already behind. And so we're asking our K-12 system to catch them up. And K-12 systems and educators and schools weren't designed to catch kids up. They were designed to teach children 1 year of content at a time. We found that about 3% of school districts in this country are teaching 1.5 years of education per every grade year. But again, if you're already kindergarten behind, you're never going to catch up even at the best schools. So again, this is, thinking about the investments we're making both as a federal government, but also state governments. If we're making huge investments in our K-12 system, we really need the yields that we're asking, our teachers and our educators to do. So next slide, please. At the same time, the demands of our workforce are rapidly changing. I don't think this is news to anyone, but what we have seen over the years is that technology is automating a ton of jobs, right? So the demand for jobs that require more critical thinking skills, more problem solving skills, all the skills that you and I use every day to be good at our jobs, so addressing conflict, working in teams, all of those are skills that we actually started to develop in our first 5 years of life. So our ability to use this higher level thinking and execution, it's crucial that we learn those skills from a very early age. And then as we continue to grow and develop more skills, we're building on a strong foundation. So this is not to say that an investment in a third grader is not worth it. Absolutely it is, but it's a question of we're laying a strong foundation or we're laying a foundation, right? It's like we're building a house. So either we can lay a strong foundation and build the house right, or you can fix the foundation, and it's definitely possible, but it's way more expensive and it's a lot costlier, right? So it's harder to do and it's more expensive. And so when we look at not only our investments in education, but also what will be required of a 3-year-old, in 20 years, it's going to be those routine skills, or not those routine skills. Sorry, I was looking at the slide. It's going to be the social skills that require critical thinking, problem solving, working in a team. Next slide, please. So what we heard from employers and chambers across the country was that, this was great information. We were making the business case, but what they really needed to be effective in their communities was state-specific data. And so we chose 4 states, Idaho being one of them. And we wanted to choose 4 that are very different geographically, with industry. They all have very different investments in early childhood education systems with state investments. And we also wanted to have the buy-in of the state chamber. So Alex, who I know is not with us today, as Matt said, has been a huge champion and a great partner of ours. And we asked, we wanted to partner with the state chamber on every single one of these reports. We didn't want to do this without their buy-in and their commitment to use this data to be effective in, however they saw fit. We also asked that they identify an early education partner because we really want to see the business community collaborate more effectively with the early education community in states where we've seen some great results. So Beth, I think, is with us today from the Idaho AEYC. She's also been an incredible partner of ours. And so Alex and Beth really were incredible champions, and we could not have done this report without them. But that being said, we found that Idaho loses $479 million annually. Obviously that's the smallest amount, but I think population-wise, it's reflective of how these states stack up. In Mississippi, for example, the cost that they're losing annually is greater than their rainy day fund. So not only is the fund a pretty stagnant number, but this is annual losses. And again, these are losses when the economy was strong and unemployment was low. So this is just exacerbating problems that were already in existence. Next slide, please. To dig in a little deeper, Idaho is losing 65 million of that directly in just lost tax revenue. We've followed the example of several other state reports that have done similar work and thought it would be helpful to break down what tax revenue is being lost and then also what is the direct cost to employers. Obviously they're interconnected, but as you can see, 414 million, which is the loss to Idaho, is directly to employers. This is in absenteeism, this is in turnover costs. So really childcare is a huge factor in recruiting and retaining a skilled workforce. Next slide, please. For Idaho parents, we found that about half, it was more like 55% of working parents reported missing due to childcare issues. And again, I sound like a broken record, but this being pre-pandemic, I think Matt is a perfect example, right? Of parents are trying to cobble I'll work 8 to 4 or 8 to noon, and then you work 12 to 4, whatever, trying to cobble together care when childcare programs or home-based providers are closed or operating, only for essential workers. We also found that 23% of student parents postponed a school or training program because of childcare breakdowns. And so we thought this was huge to talk about because those parents are potentially taking on student debt, just to be able to go to school, and they're delaying their degree or their certification programs because of childcare. In Idaho, I think, as I said earlier, 78% of families are working with a extended family member to try and provide care. I think what's really important during COVID-19 is that many families may feel like it's too risky to, expose other family members. And so there are a lot of ripple effects as a result of COVID-19 on how families are having to deal with access to childcare. I think the biggest thing for all of you to understand is if you are an employer, parents are really expected to figure this out on their own. And I think this is where employers and the business community have a great opportunity to step in and change that. So next slide, please. Moving into COVID-19, we had planned to expand these reports, but we realized quickly that in March, we were going to have to pivot because the employer community, working parents, and providers were asking us for new data that would be applicable to the situation that they're dealing with. So we looked at 3 different audiences: childcare providers, working parents, and employers. For providers, you may or may not know that the majority of childcare in this country is done by private small business owners. There's roughly 675,000 providers in this country. The vast majority of them are small business owners. As we've seen the response to support small businesses, often these childcare providers are not included in those supports or are missing out. So there are some unique interventions that childcare providers can have, but really we wanted to look at them as small business owners. They're educators, they're nurses, they're cleaning, they're being expected to do all these things, but at the end of the day, they are trying to run a business. They're hiring staff, they're trying to make sure that they're keeping themselves and children safe. So that's a lot to ask of a small business owner who may only have a handful of employees, if any at all. We also wanted to look at the impact on working parents. For many folks, overnight, they were asked to do full-time caregiving and full-time work. And so, that has not been the typical scenario. So we wanted to see how parents are making decisions, either to go back to work, to change their careers, or make adjustments of some kind. And then lastly, we wanted to see how employers are communicating with their working parents and understanding if they're aware of the childcare needs, if they're connecting with their working parents on this issue. So next slide, please. A few of the results. This is our first of 3 working parent surveys. We're actually releasing our second one tomorrow. So, there will be new data points to share, but I want 2 main points. One is that 1 in 5 working parents felt like their childcare arrangement was impacting their ability to go back to work. To their pre-COVID work situation. So that means either going from full-time to part-time, that means changing employers, or that means leaving the workforce altogether. And in every single one of those scenarios, that has financial implications on families and employers. So again, if you're an employer and you're thinking about your workforce and 1 in 5 of your working parents may not be able to come back to work, that could be a pretty significant percentage of your working folks. So as you're planning, return to work plans, I'm sure you're assuming that, or hoping that the majority of your staff will come back. But that may not be the case for working parents who are struggling with the needs of young children. At the same time, parents really feel like their provisional childcare arrangements are not working. In the report that we're going to release tomorrow, we found that 11% of parents have already turned down a promotion since COVID-19 because of childcare. So parents aren't making decisions based on what's best for the financial viability for their families. They're making permanent career decisions based on temporary childcare needs. And that's not a situation that we want any working parent to be in. Next slide. Lastly, we looked at employers and returning to work. I feel like I've shared a lot of not, happy news, but one important thing that I want to point out is that 92% of employers felt like they were aware of their childcare needs of their working parents. This is a huge number that I really want to highlight because I don't have a data point for pre-pandemic, but I can guarantee you it was not 92%. I have had more employers call us asking for help, more stepping up and saying this is an issue for our membership. And I have been thrilled that this is one silver lining of a pandemic. Did not anticipate this conversation. I think the leadership of IACI and the Boise Metro Chamber is great to highlight how childcare is impacting their members. So I hope that we can leave on this high note that even though there's a lot of, not a lot of great solutions at the moment, and even though there's a lot of loss happening, I think this is really presenting us with an opportunity to make a change so that the narrative is different come, a year from now. And with that, I think I'll take some questions.
Sorry, I had to add myself back. Julia. Thank you for that presentation. I mean, those are some pretty sobering numbers. If I'm a business owner, what are some initial steps I could take to engage in this conversation?
I think the most important thing I've said to every business or employer is that you need to understand the needs of your workforce and you need to understand the context in which you're operating. So for every employer, that could be something as simple as a survey. We've had, the chamber has sent out multiple surveys. I know folks are really over-surveyed, but I think it's crucial for you to understand who's being impacted. One thing that we have found, I don't think, any early education folks who are listening in, this won't surprise you, but in all 4 of the reports, we asked if you left a job training program voluntarily because of childcare problems, so you weren't fired, you chose to leave because you didn't have a choice, or you chose to leave because that was what you needed because of childcare breakdowns, what age your child was, and almost 100% of parents in all 4 states said their child was under the age of 3. So I think it's really important as an employer to know that our supply of care for children under the age of 3 is very, very scarce across the country. So I think you need to know who is most vulnerable in your workforce. It's not, when children are, 4 or 5, I think parents see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Kids are going to school. But it's those earlier years between birth and 3 that parents are really struggling to say, I don't know that this is sustainable. And that's only just with one. You may have multiple children, and then that's compounded. So I'd really encourage you to understand the needs of your working parents first before you think about any solutions.
And my wife and I are really lucky because we had a early child care center here in the valley called Giraffe Laugh, and they were closed for a long time, and that was extremely difficult on both of us. But as they've reopened, it's taken the pressure off of our family. But we know that now that kids in elementary are only in school part-time, it's increasingly difficult for a different generation of parents. Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children has a needs assessment that I wanted to put up here. And this is for businesses who need to kind of go in and do a deep dive as to where their business is at and where their employees are at. And Julia, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Talk a little bit about how different industries and different business sizes could approach this solution differently.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm totally biased and I'll plug, I think Idaho AUIC, I would definitely encourage you to check out that business toolkit. I'd also encourage you, we have a case studies matrix where we have a handful of examples of how businesses or chambers have made investments in addressing the needs of their working parents. And the reason why I bring it up is because there isn't one size fits all solution, and there's not like the best practice. So if you're an employer, you do not need to have on-site childcare if that's not going to address the needs of your working parents. I encourage everyone to understand the context in which they're operating, because there is a system of care around you. It might be underfunded, it might be under-resourced, it might be disjointed, but there is a system of care. And so for every employer, I want them to understand that they don't have to get into the business of childcare, right? They need to find the right partners, like Idaho AUIC. Again, I'm totally biased, but they need to find the right partners to say, how can we draw on your deep expertise of this issue? How can we understand this problem from a very localized perspective? And so really, this is an opportunity for every employer to get to know the context. For smaller employers, I'd really encourage you to see what makes the most sense financially. Unfortunately, for every employer, you are already paying for this problem. So I think getting the data secure on how you're paying for it. I just spoke to a large multinational company, and they were asking for solutions, and I asked them what percentage of their employees are working parents and which ones have children under the age of 5. And they had no answers. They didn't know that data. And so I can't give you a solution until you have a good sense of the impact. That being said, there are some great options like subsidizing care at a nearby center, or giving a stipend to working parents that maybe that is more financially viable for you as an employer than, say, on-site care. The reason why, on this issue, but the reason why I say you need to understand the needs of your workforce because your solution looks differently. So for example, I've spoken with a ton of healthcare systems, and the majority of them, if they have a solution, it's on-site care, because they have, highly specialized staff that they are oftentimes recruiting from, a different state or a different city. And the hours in which they're working are non-traditional. So they're either long shifts or they're, weekends or evenings. So I really encourage you to think through what the needs of your workforce are before finding a solution.
That kind of brings into question the idea of having childcare that is at least close by your workplace. I know a lot of people in Idaho who might work in downtown Boise, but they have their childcare out in West Boise or even Meridian because of a lack of spaces available in the downtown areas. Can you talk about a little bit about the importance of that, having childcare that's at least geographically close to the workplace for families?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is a little, because it's a example from a large metro in the Bay Area of California, but there's a group that's looking at a multi-sector approach. We've told a story about them online, so I'd be happy to share for you. But they found that the cost of living was skyrocketing in their county. And so, either working parents were traveling from outside the county to work, or providers were having to leave the county because of how expensive it was. And for them, they were really concerned about traffic and the impact of childcare nearby an employer and how that impacts, access to toll roads and traffic in a highly concentrated area. And so they have made investments with developers, as the county, with municipalities, to really make sure that any new real estate developments include childcare if possible. So, it's a business park and they have every other tenant pay towards ground floor location, or they're helping offset the cost of a rent or mortgage for childcare providers so that they could keep childcare close to where they live or work.
What could businesses, small and large, do to increase access to childcare in the Boise area, or for that matter, in the entire state of Idaho? What are some of the steps that businesses can take?
I think recognizing that this is a workforce issue is a huge first step. That's really crucial. I think using your platform to validate that this is an issue that is not just a family issue, it's not just a women's issue, but it's really impacting your bottom line, I think is going to move this conversation out of kind of sometimes the echo chamber that it's in and move it into more mainstream conversations. I think we have seen this with our own membership of who's raised their hand and said, hey, we really need help on this. We've seen this in the number of media outlets that are reporting on this, and it's no longer targeted to, parenting articles. It's, the Wall Street Journal is writing about childcare. I think that would never have happened for, us to not be in a pandemic, with people like the business community really speaking up and saying, this is an issue that cannot just be solved with this one sector. I think early education advocates have been incredible in getting us to where we are right now. We would not be where we are without their tireless work. That being said, I think if we're really going to move the needle on this issue, I think employers need to speak up and say that this is an issue that's not just impacting their ability to recruit and retain skilled workers, but it's really impacting the ability of the state to grow, right? If you're an employer and you're trying to open up multiple locations, or if you're the state of Idaho and you're trying to recruit new businesses to the state to generate, revenue for the state, you really have to think about the role that childcare plays in your ability to attract new business to the state.
There's a comment here that talks a little bit about how the pandemic has also changed our work, and it has introduced more flexibility. One day we're at home, the next day we're at the office, but has that impacted some of the vision of the future of childcare and the economic impacts of that? I can speak to that personally. Whether I'm at the office or I'm at home, if I don't have a consistent place to send Louise and know that she's being cared for, it's hard for me to focus on the workplace. But do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I think so. In all the surveys that we did, we asked working parents to prioritize what they would want their employer to do. And in all 4 states, flexible work schedules really rose to the top. So I think for any employer, if you're concerned about the financial in addressing the childcare needs, I think flexible work schedules, or if you're a hourly wage employee or employer, predictive scheduling is really helpful in addressing childcare challenges. And it may be a lower resource, low hanging fruit for you to do. I think COVID has definitely taught us that that's possible. I just heard from Cox Communications. They, were in many states deemed an essential employer. So they've had to stay open for all of the pandemic. Most of their employees have moved remotely, but not all, because they have, technicians who have to be out in the field. And what they have done is time blocking. So if I have childcare needs, I may work from to noon, but then I have caregiving needs from 12 to 4, and then I go back to work from 4 to 8. And that has allowed, as an employer, being aware of my needs and then giving me the flexibility to say, I can work around my childcare needs, or if my family and I are trying to cobble together care, I can make my own schedule in a way that I get my work done this chunk of time that I can really be a full-time parent and caregiver. I think is going to do great work for their employees. As an employer, they have already said that this has paid off and that they've been able to retain most of their workforce. They've been able to really get the work done that they've needed to, but in the way that working parents can do so.
There's another question, and you've mostly answered it, but it's really, how can businesses prepare for families that might have stints at home intermittently? Because, for example, a early childhood education teacher tests positive for COVID, and so the facility is shut down for 14 days. Speaking a little bit to the flex scheduling is probably critical, but did you have anything else to add to that?
I think that's a really challenging one. I think childcare providers are working really hard to keep themselves and children safe. That being said, I think when you're having children in a facility and you're having staff in a program, a breakout at some point is probably inevitable. I think one thing an employer or a working parent or anyone who's a champion of this issue can recognize is that childcare providers are small business owners. And so as a result, they are having to get PPE just like the rest of us. For many of the smaller providers, they're going to Costco or Walmart, just like you and I are, for hand sanitizer or gloves or bleach. And so I think if you're an employer and you're already providing PPE for your workforce, if you can donate some of that to a nearby childcare center, if you can give any of that to a program to help ensure that they're staying as safe as possible. Dennis, I know this isn't your exact question, but or maybe that was Brie, I can't remember, but I just would really encourage every person who can think of ways to support the providers themselves in staying safe. If you have access to those materials, definitely, talk to a local provider and see if you can help offset the cost of the additional cleaning supplies. That being said, I think as an employer, if your workforce has to stay home because of limited access, because of COVID exposure, I think that's a really tough scenario. And I'm sure more people than we would want are going to be in that scenario. But I think if you set the precedents of flexible working schedules, it will continue to pay off when you have a situation where someone's home because of COVID.
And coupled with that, if there is somebody who's exposed and they're forced to go into quarantine, there are some federal bills that were passed early on to help with both the coverage of that sick leave if it's necessary, but also the coverage of that time away from work to take care of your child if it's necessary. And the Boise Metro Chamber has that information if you need it. Julia, this has been a lot of data. I mean, this is an incredible amount of research you've done into the state of Idaho, but if there's one thing that you wanted people to take away from this presentation, what would it be?
I think a lot of these numbers can feel a little bit like doom and gloom. And I think in the middle of a pandemic, it can feel pretty overwhelming. I think that every person who's listening in, whatever position you're in, I would encourage you to use your platform to recognize that this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. And that you have some agency in being part of the solution. So for every employer, I want to emphasize that you have a huge opportunity to lift up this issue in a way that has never been lifted up, and really lend your voice to the conversation to say, we need to find solutions. If you're working, really encourage you to speak to your employer and really normalize that childcare is impacting everyone's ability to work. I think having 4-year-olds running in on Zoom calls, I think has helped normalize it for sure. But I think, again, the more transparency we can have, if you are safe and comfortable to do so with your employer, I'd really encourage you to bring it up, because I think the more that employers hear from their working parents that this is an issue that will help you stay in the workforce longer, I think the more that they will buy into this, if they haven't already.
Yeah, that's huge. Right as you were doing that, there was one more question that popped in here that's really kind of about some of the challenges that childcare's facilities are facing. I know our facility's facing it, so they've had to shorten hours, but finding adequate employees, particularly with the rise of kind of home pods and other ways to recruit people to teach. So childcare facilities are lacking in the ability to hire the right people. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, there are lots of different scenarios where you can take your child to a licensed, regulated childcare program, whether that's home-based. So one person who's operating out of their home, but is licensed and caring for, depending on the age of the children, 4 to 6 kids. That already exists. And so I think what's hard about the learning pods is that people are trying to cobble together a solution when they're feeling safe of smaller groups, but that's often unregulated, unlicensed, not quality care. And those initiatives can hurt the broader system. And I worry that parents are desperate, right? I don't want to blame anyone who is trying to figure out a solution just to survive this pandemic, right? We don't have an end in sight and people are really struggling, and I get that. But I think knowing that the decisions to siphon off high quality teachers from either programs is ultimately going to make this problem worse. And so one thing that we found is that parents were utilizing home-based providers at pre-pandemic levels, nearly. And I think that's a great opportunity to say that if parents are feeling safer in smaller groups, then as a system, we need to do a better job of ensuring that we increase the supply of home-based providers. There are lots of folks who have been laid off that could open up a new, home-based care center or home-based provider, pending they work with, Idaho AUIC to get the licensing, or, work with the state to make sure that they're offering quality care. But I think there are ways that we can go through making sure that we're safe and comfortable, and that we're not hurting the system in the long term. I don't know if that answered your question adequately, but hopefully.
No, it did. I mean, you have a childcare system that's built on small business owners who are committed to providing high quality care. We know it's an expense to working families to get into that high quality care, and that transfers to being able to find the right people, hire the right people at a rate where you can keep them. I mean, you presented a very difficult struggle, and there's, like you said, there's not a one size fits all solution for this. Our education and workforce committee has been really focused on this issue, and we just really appreciate you taking the time with us today to give us a more national perspective and to provide us with the research that the U.S. Chamber Foundation has provided. We also really appreciate our partnership with the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry and the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children. This is an important issue. This is increasingly something that is prevalent as a result of COVID. And Julie, I want to thank you again for being here today. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And last but not least, October is Cybersecurity Month, and a lot of small businesses lack access to a professional who might help them with cybersecurity. So the remainder of the month, we do have a couple of virtual events that are dedicated to cybersecurity, both for small businesses and on a more broad statewide or national concerns. Those can be found on our social media pages and on our blog posts. But again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to thank Julia, the U.S. Chamber Foundation, and all of our partners in this process. Thanks, and we'll see you all very soon.